the most famous female serial killer in history was never charged, never tried, and never faced a single judge. No court in Europe issued a verdict against her. 4 of her servants were tortured into confessions and executed within weeks, but Elizabeth Báthory herself sat in a room in her own castle until she died, and nobody ever proved she killed anyone. That sentence should bother you, because if you grew up on any version of this story, you heard about the Blood Countess who bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth. You heard about 650 dead girls. You heard about a monster so prolific that Guinness once gave her a world record, and almost none of it holds up when you look at where the claims actually came from. Born on the 7th of August, 1560, in Nyírbátor, in the Kingdom of Hungary, Báthory Erzsébet entered the world as a member of one of the most powerful families on the European continent. Her family crest featured 3 wolf teeth surrounded by a dragon biting its own tail, granted in 1325. The name Báthory carried weight that most modern people cannot easily grasp. The House of Báthory had split into 2 branches, the Somlyo line and the Exid line, and between them they controlled thrones, armies and churches across Eastern Europe. Her uncle Stephen was King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania from 1576 until his death in 1586. Her cousin Christopher served as Prince of Transylvania. Another cousin, Andrew, became a cardinal. Her cousin Sigismund held the Transylvanian throne multiple times between 1586 and 1602. On her father's side, her older brother Stephen served as Judge Royal of Hungary. The Báthorys did not serve the crown. In many practical respects, they were the crown. Elizabeth was raised at Exid Castle, the family stronghold, and she grew up Calvinist Protestant in a region where your denomination could get you killed. Both her parents died in 1570 when she was around 10 years old. Her father, Baron George VI Báthory, came from the Exed branch, which had produced the Palatine of Hungary, the highest office in the kingdom after the king himself. Her mother, Baroness Anna Báthory, came from the Somlyo branch, which produced kings and cardinals. This matters because Elizabeth was the product of both lines of the dynasty, which united the 2 most powerful families in Hungary under one bloodline. The Báthorys were bigger landowners than the Hungarian crown itself. They were not simply wealthy nobles, they were a parallel government. Her parents were both Báthorys from different branches, which meant a degree of consanguinity that historians like Raymond McNally flagged as a source of medical problems across the family tree. Constant intermarriage among Hungarian noble families produced visible consequences. The Báthorys generated kings, cardinals and war heroes, but the same bloodlines also produced members with severe health issues and unstable reputations. Gabriel Báthory, the last male of the Somlyo line, who served as Prince of Transylvania from 1608 to 1613, was widely described as erratic and violent. This was a family that ran on power and proximity, and the costs of that proximity showed up across generations. Elizabeth herself began having seizures around age 4 or 5, what doctors of the time called the falling sickness. She suffered violent mood swings and painful migraines throughout her childhood. The treatment prescribed for her seizures tells you something about the era she lived in. Physicians recommended rubbing the blood of an unaffected person on her lips. Some historians have speculated that this childhood medical practice planted the earlier seed of the blood mythology that would consume her reputation a century after she was dead. Whatever her medical problems, Elizabeth was extraordinarily well educated. She was fluent in 4 languages: Hungarian, Latin, German and Greek. She could read and write in all 4, which was vanishingly rare for any person in the 16th century and nearly unheard of for a woman. Some sources describe her as largely self-taught. Her future husband, Ferenc Nadasdy, was by all accounts less educated than she was, and Elizabeth helped him with his Latin correspondence. Remember that detail. It tells you who she was, not an ignorant provincial noblewoman locked in a tower, but one of the most intellectually capable people in Hungary. She married Ferenc Nadasdy on the 8th of May 1575 at the Palace of Vranov in what is now Slovakia. Elizabeth was 14 or 15. Ferenc was 19. He was the only son of Tamas Nadasdy, a key royal advisor who had turned Sava Castle into a centre of Hungarian Lutheran reform, complete with a printing house and school. Around 4,500 guests attended the wedding. Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian II was invited but too ill to come and sent an expensive gift instead. The engagement date is disputed between historians, with some saying 1571 when Elizabeth was 11 and others saying 1574. The difference likely reflects the gap between the initial betrothal agreement and the formal engagement. The marriage came with an arrangement that was almost unheard of for the period. By mutual agreement, Ferenc adopted Elizabeth's maiden surname rather than the other way around. He became a Báthory. In 16th century aristocratic marriages, names flowed from husband to wife without exception, and this reversal reflected a simple political reality. The Báthory family was so much more powerful than the Nadasdis that keeping her name was a condition of the match. Elizabeth insisted on it. Ferenc's wedding gift to her was Castle Čachtice and its surrounding lands in the Little Carpathians. The castle sat on a limestone hill at 375 metres above sea level, overlooking the Var Valley, and had been built in the 1250s by Comes Casimir of the Hunt-Poznan family. Originally Romanesque, later expanded to Gothic, then renovated again in the Renaissance. It would become the most famous building in this entire story, and not for reasons anyone intended. Their first child, a daughter named Anna, was not born until 1585, 10 years after the wedding. That is a long gap by 16th century standards, and nobody has a clean explanation for it. After Anna came Orsolya in 1590, Catalin in 1594, a son named Andras in 1596 who died at age 7, and finally Pál in 1598. Anna married into the Zrinski family, one of the most famous military dynasties in Hungary. Pál survived into adulthood, became the father of Ferenc III Nadasdy, and would later play a direct role in negotiating his mother's imprisonment. To understand anything about Elizabeth Báthory's life, you need to understand the world she lived in, because every documentary about her presents the crimes in a vacuum, as if 16th century Hungary was a quiet place where nothing else was happening. Hungary had been ripped into 3 pieces after the catastrophic Battle of Mohács in 1526, where King Louis II and most of the Hungarian nobility were massacred by the Ottomans. Budapest fell under Ottoman control. The Báthory estates sat in the frontier zone between Habsburg Royal Hungary and Ottoman-occupied Hungary, which was an active war zone for most of Elizabeth's adult life. The village of Čachtice had previously been plundered by Ottoman raiders. Sava Castle, the Nadasdy family seat, sat right on the Ottoman border. During the Long Turkish War from 1593 to 1606, Elizabeth's estates lay directly on the invasion route to Vienna. She was personally responsible for defence against Ottoman raids, for medical care for her tenants, and for supporting war widows and their families. While her husband was away fighting, which he was for years at a stretch, Elizabeth single-handedly managed all Nadasdy Báthory estates: business affairs, military defence, legal correspondence, the administration of a vast territory. She was the ruler of a small kingdom, and she ran it during a war that lasted 13 years. Ferenc Nadasdy earned the Ottoman title the Black Bey for his ferocity in battle. He captured the bridgehead at Parkani with Miklos Pálffy. He helped recapture Esztergom in September 1595. He took Visegrad in 1595, Vac in 1597, Győr in 1598, specialising in mobile hussar ambush units that struck fast and disappeared. The Ottomans feared him enough to give him a name. When he died on the 4th of January 1604 at Sava Castle from a chronic leg infection, he was approximately 48 years old and celebrated across Hungary as a national hero. He was also, by every account that survives, a deeply cruel man. He reportedly brought Elizabeth a claw-like contraption from the war front designed to tear, stab, and cut victims. He taught her torture techniques, including placing oiled paper between the toes and fingers of servant girls and setting them on fire. He enjoyed torturing servants when he was home, though sources note he stopped short of killing them. Despite all of this, he attracted zero legal scrutiny, not a letter of complaint, not a whisper of investigation. A man who actively taught and participated in servant torture was celebrated as a hero. A woman accused of the same was imprisoned. That contrast is one of the strongest arguments the revisionist historians make, and it is hard to argue against. To understand why torturing servants did not register as a crime in this world, you need to go back 46 years before Elizabeth was born. In 1514, the Dossa peasant revolt failed catastrophically. The Hungarian Diet responded by condemning the entire peasant class to real and perpetual servitude. Peasants lost the right to relocate, own land, or access any form of legal protection. This legal status held until 1848, more than 300 years. György Thurzó himself was executed by being placed on a heated iron throne and crowned with a red-hot iron circlet. His starving followers were forced to eat his roasted flesh. Around 70,000 peasants were killed in the suppression. After that, the legal status of a serf in Hungary was barely above livestock. Killing servants was described by one historian as gauche but not really illegal for a noble. Hungarian law identified the nobility as the Hungarian nation. Everyone else was the wretched tax-paying mass with no legal personhood. Corvée, forced unpaid labour, increased to 2 or 3 days per week in the second half of the 16th century. When you hear about dead servants at Hungarian castles in this era, you're not hearing about something unusual. You're hearing about the background noise of a feudal system built on institutional violence. What changed in Báthory's case was not the severity of what she was accused of. What changed was the class of victim. Killing peasants could be tolerated. Killing fellow nobles could not. In 1609, Báthory opened a gymnasium, a finishing school for daughters of lesser nobility. This was common practice among wealthy Hungarian families. Powerful households accepted the daughters of lesser nobles to educate them in etiquette, languages, and household management. It was a form of social advancement for the families who sent their girls, and a form of influence building for the families who received them. When noble-born girls began disappearing from this school, their families had the social standing to demand an investigation. Before the gymnasium, the Báthory's political connections had shielded Elizabeth. If servants died or went missing, nobody of consequence cared. Afterward, the families of missing noble daughters had both the motive and the political weight to push back. The violence may or may not have changed in character. What changed was that the victims now had fathers who could write letters to the Palatine. After Ferenc died in 1604, Elizabeth was alone and exposed. She no longer had a war hero husband providing political cover. The accusations claimed that she and 4 servants tortured and killed hundreds of young women and girls between roughly 1590 and 1610, with most alleged crimes occurring after her husband's death. Victims were said to be primarily servant girls, though later allegations extended to the young noblewomen sent to her household for education. The alleged methods were extreme even by the standards of a violent era. Witnesses described needles driven into fingers, lips, and noses, beatings so severe that bodies were black as charcoal and their skin was rent and torn. Red-hot pokers applied to mouths and noses, victims stripped naked and forced into ice baths in winter, victims covered in honey and left outside for insects, biting, burning, starvation. The descriptions are vivid and disturbing, and they came from depositions collected by one man. György Thurzó served as Palatine of Hungary, the highest office after the king, from 1609 to 1616. In 1610, King Matthias II assigned him to investigate Báthory. Between 1610 and 1611, Thurzó collected depositions from over 300 witnesses. On December 29, 1610, he raided the Čachtice manor, claiming to have caught Báthory in the act. According to his own letter to his wife, he found 1 dead girl and 1 living girl described as prey. Except the surprise was not a surprise. Tony Thorne's research into Thurzó's personal correspondence shows the raid was premeditated. Thurzó had been moving against Báthory for over a year before the arrest. His wife kept forgetting to write in code, so the pre-planning is documented in their own letters. When Thurzó arrived at the castle, Báthory was having dinner. She was not actively tormenting anyone. The raid was theatre. The conclusion had already been written. Thorne put it directly. It is entirely possible her greatest crime was being wealthy. Of 289 witness accounts collected during the investigation, more than 250 offered either hearsay or no direct information. They had not personally seen any crimes. They were reporting rumours. Researcher Shelley Puhak found that witnesses from different counties used suspiciously similar wording, which suggests possible orchestration of testimony. The court scribe explicitly marked multiple statements as known only from hearsay. What looks at first glance like an overwhelming body of evidence, over 300 witnesses, collapses on closer inspection into a thin layer of first-hand accounts buried under a mountain of gossip. The 4 accomplices who were arrested, Ilona Jo, Dorothea Sentes, a man called Fichko, and Katalin Benecki, were all tortured before trial. A 5th accomplice, Anna Darvulia, was frequently mentioned in testimony. She was described as a witch from Sarvar who was particularly intimate with Báthory and may have instigated the worst of the crimes. Darvulia is the most mysterious figure in the entire case. She appears constantly in the depositions, blamed for everything, but she died around 1609 before the investigation began, so she could never be interrogated or defend herself. Her death made her the perfect scapegoat. Under initial questioning, all 4 surviving accomplices blamed Darvulia for everything. When the torture intensified, they shifted their blame from the dead woman to Elizabeth. That escalation pattern, blaming the person who cannot respond first, and then shifting to the actual target once the pressure increases, is consistent with coerced testimony across centuries of legal history. 2 trials were held at Bitcha, the first on January 2nd, 1611, where 17 witnesses testified. The second on January 7th, 1611. Ilona Jo admitted involvement in around 50 killings and described applying red-hot pokers to victims. Fichko claimed he was brought to Báthory's service by force and counted 37 girls. Dorothea Sentes detailed needle and fingers practices. Katalin Benecki testified with apparent honesty, hoping for leniency. 3 of the accomplices were executed. Ilona Jo and Dorothea Sentes had their fingers torn out with red-hot pincers and were burned alive. Fichko was beheaded, receiving a lesser punishment due to his youth. Benecki received a life sentence. So where does the number 650 come from? That number has been repeated for centuries as established fact. It comes from a single witness named Susanna, and she is the only one of 303 witnesses who did not provide a last name. Susanna testified that she had heard that a man named Jakab Silvasi, a court official working about 100 miles away, had found a register in Báthory's trunk listing 650 dead girls, signed by Báthory herself. Count what is wrong with that. Susanna was repeating a second-hand story. She never saw the document. Silvasi himself never mentioned the register in his own testimony. The court scribe explicitly flagged it as hearsay. The document was never produced as evidence. No historian has ever located such a register. The accomplices who were physically present and who confessed under torture gave numbers between 36 and 51, vastly lower than 650. The official count from the trial itself was approximately 80. Guinness World Records listed Báthory in 1968 as the most prolific female murderer with 610 victims and has since removed or disregarded that record because the number is disputed and her guilt is uncertain. Which brings us to the thing everyone thinks they know, the bloodbaths. Elizabeth Báthory bathing in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth. It is the single most famous detail of her story, and it appears nowhere in the trial transcripts, not in the depositions, not in the 300+ witness statements, not in any document from 1610 or 1611, nowhere. The first written mention of bloodbathing comes from a Jesuit scholar named Laszlo Turoczi, who published a book called Tragica Historia in 1729 in what is now Trnava, Slovakia. That is 115 years after Báthory died. Turoczi was writing during the Catholic Counter-Reformation, and his biases were severe. He framed Báthory's story as a moral lesson about the dangers of Protestantism. She was Calvinist. Turoczi treated her departure from Catholicism as the root sin leading to her damnation. He combined local oral tradition, scattered historical sources, and what appear to be freely invented details. He made demonstrable errors, including getting Báthory's religious denomination wrong in his own text. His narrative was repeated by at least 3 subsequent historians in the 18th and 19th centuries, each one adding embellishments. By the time the Gothic literary tradition seized on the story, bloodbathing was treated as established fact. The aristocratic depravity motif was irresistible to writers looking for horror with a pedigree, and Báthory became the female counterpart to Vlad the Impaler in the European imagination. When the actual witness accounts were published for the first time in 1817, they contained 0 references to bloodbaths. The publication barely dented the public perception. The sensational version was already too deeply embedded to be dislodged by evidence. People preferred the monster. They still do. What happened to Báthory's reputation is a case study in how history gets corrupted in layers, and once you see the process, you cannot unsee it. The event itself, 1610 to 1614, produced an arrest, a servant trial, house arrest, and a death. No public trial, no verdict against her personally, documents sealed. Then Turozzi arrived in 1729 with his counter-Reformation propaganda, and the blood-bathing legend was born. It was not a minor embellishment, it was an invention from whole cloth, published 115 years after the fact, by a man with religious motives, factual errors in his own text, and no access to the sealed trial documents. Gothic amplification through the 18th and 19th centuries made each retelling more lurid than the last. Raymond McNally published Dracula Was a Woman in 1983, the first English-language non-fiction account, and argued that Bram Stoker based Dracula partly on Báthory. That thesis has been largely debunked by later scholars, but the book brought the Blood Countess story to English-speaking audiences for the first time, and McNally's sensational framing became the default version in the Anglophone world. Revisionism only started in the 1980s, when Josef Kočiš opened Slovak archives, and Laszlo Nagy argued the case was political. Rigorous scholarship followed with Tony Thorne in 1997 and Kimberly Craft in 2009, who translated all primary documents into English for the first time. Craft's work is considered the gold standard. Puhak's 2026 biography is the first English-language account since Thorne's, nearly 30 years later. None of it mattered much to popular culture. Films, television, and video games still present the blood-bathing as fact, because the sensational version sells better than the complicated truth. Two recent findings deserve attention because they have not appeared in any documentary yet. In 2026, Shelley Puhak published a book that uncovered something about the term carnifex, used against Báthory in letters between Lutheran pastors. For centuries, scholars translated carnifex as butcher or executioner. Puhak argues it more likely referred to someone who was not observing the Lenten fast properly. If she is right, the initial complaints about Báthory were about religious laxity, not murder. The accusation of killing came later, layered on top of a charge that started as dietary criticism. In 2024, Dr. Anuchka Bailey at the University of Cambridge proposed something even more radical. Bailey's theory is that Báthory was a radical Protestant who used her wealth and her castle to educate young women and smuggle banned books. The coffins leaving her castle may have contained books, not bodies. Evidence exists that Báthory had a printing press in her husband's castle, with tunnels leading out. Her husband's father, Tamas Nadasti, had made Savar a centre of Hungarian Lutheran reform, founding a printing house and school there decades earlier. The infrastructure for producing and distributing Protestant literature was physically present in the castles Elizabeth controlled. Under Bailey's theory, the academy she ran for young noblewomen was a place for women to learn to read and encounter Reformation ideas, and the entire case against her was an attempt to shut down a Protestant education operation during the Counter-Reformation. It is speculative, but it accounts for details that the murder narrative struggles to explain, including why so many coffins were seen leaving, and why Báthory was so protective of what happened inside her walls. The financial motive for destroying Báthory is blunt and well documented. King Matthias II owed her a substantial debt that was cancelled after her arrest. Matthias openly stated that if Báthory received the death penalty, her property would revert to the crown. Thurzó wanted his son to become Prince of Transylvania, in direct competition with Báthory's family. Elizabeth was financially supporting her cousin Gábor Báthory, who was Prince of Transylvania from 1608 to 1613, and was seeking Ottoman-backed independence from Habsburg rule. That made her a direct political threat to King Matthias. She was not simply a wealthy widow minding her own business, she was bankrolling a rival prince who wanted to break away from Habsburg control with Ottoman support. From the perspective of the Habsburg court, destroying Elizabeth Báthory was not personal, it was strategic. The deal that ended the affair was negotiated between Thurzó, Báthory's son Pál, and her two sons-in-law. The family agreed to cancel the debts the crown owed Elizabeth. In return, Elizabeth would be confined privately rather than dragged through a public trial that could embarrass the noble class. The family kept their estates. The crown eliminated its debt and neutralised a political rival. Everyone in a position of power got something they wanted. The only person who lost everything was Elizabeth. There is, however, a complication that weakens the pure conspiracy theory. Her property was not formally confiscated after the arrest. It passed to her children. If this were a straightforward land grab, the crown would have seized the estates outright. The debt cancellation and political motivations remain strong evidence, but the seizure of wealth did not fully happen. The reality is messier than a clean frame-up narrative allows, and there is another wrinkle that complicates every neat theory about this case. The investigation was initially sparked by a man named István Magyari, a Lutheran minister who complained about Báthory between 1602 and 1604. Thurzó himself was also Lutheran, not Catholic. If this was simply a Catholic Habsburg plot against a Protestant noblewoman, the key complainant and the chief investigator would not both be Protestant. Scholar Michael Farin, who compiled and analysed the trial documents, has also noted that testimony from over 300 individuals is difficult to explain as pure fabrication, even accounting for hearsay and political pressure. Something was happening at Báthory's estates, whether it was murder, medicine, wartime casualties, or political theatre shaped into a criminal case. No historian alive can say with certainty. Whatever happened to Elizabeth Báthory, it was more tangled than any single theory accounts for. Under Hungarian law, it was illegal to try or condemn a citizen of noble birth. King Mátyás pushed hard for a trial and execution, but Thurzó arranged house arrest instead, a deal struck with Báthory's son Pál and her two sons-in-law. The family fortune stayed intact while Elizabeth was neutralised politically. They originally planned to send her to a nunnery but changed course as the accusations became too widely known. Thurzó's rationale for avoiding a public trial was telling. He argued that putting a Báthory on trial would damage the reputation of the entire Hungarian nobility. If the highest-born woman in the country could be dragged into a courtroom, no noble family was safe from the same treatment. He was protecting the class, not the individual. Elizabeth was sacrificed privately so the system would not be questioned publicly. Popular accounts say stonemasons bricked Báthory into rooms at Čachtice with only slits for ventilation and food. Whether that is true depends on which historian you ask. Some say she was fully immured. Others argue she was under house arrest and could receive guests. The most likely answer is that she was confined to certain rooms under guard, which later storytelling exaggerated into full bricking up. The walled-up image is too cinematic to resist, and centuries of retellings have preferred the more vivid version. Kimberly Craft translated around 40 surviving letters from Elizabeth, written in Old Hungarian. They reveal a mundane administrator managing cattle, servants, crop production, and legal disputes. One letter involved her chastising someone for stealing her hemp crop. Despite being the wealthiest person in Hungary, she had constant cash flow problems because her wealth was in land, not liquid assets. During massive wartime inflation, the royal treasury itself owed her money. These letters read like the correspondence of a busy, irritated landowner who could not get anyone to pay what they owed. One theory about the bodies found at Báthory's estates has received less attention than it deserves. Historian Irma Sadecki-Kardos argued that the dead and wounded found at the castle may have been wartime patients, not murder victims. Noble landowners were responsible for providing medical care to their subjects. Sick and injured people were regularly brought to castles for treatment. The contemporary treatment for seizures involved rubbing blood on the patient. The ice baths described by witnesses were a known folk medical practice. The needles driven into skin were consistent with certain folk remedies. If Báthory was running what amounted to a field hospital on an active war front, dead bodies at her castle were not evidence of murder. They were evidence of a frontier medical operation during a war that killed thousands. This is the most contested of all the revisionist arguments, but it reframes the physical evidence in a way that is difficult to dismiss outright. Between 2012 and 2014, archaeologists conducted the first systematic excavation of Čachtice Castle. They confirmed prehistoric habitation at the site, but produced no forensic evidence confirming or refuting the accusations against Báthory. No mass graves of young women were found. The castle has been in ruins for centuries, so the absence of evidence is not proof of innocence. But it is worth noting that when people finally looked with modern tools, they found nothing. On the evening of August 21st, 1614, Elizabeth complained to her guard that her hands were cold. She had been confined for roughly 4 years by then, living in the castle that had been her wedding gift from a husband who had been dead for a decade. Later that night, the guard peered through a slot and found her lying face down on the floor, dead. She was approximately 54 years old. No autopsy was performed. Natural causes were assumed. Nobody investigated further. Nobody seemed to want to know more. She was buried at the Church of St. Ladislav in Čachtice, on November 25, 1614. Villagers reportedly objected to having the tigress of Čachtice in their cemetery, and her body may have been moved to the Báthory family crypt at Erzsébet, in what is now Hungary. Not every source confirms this transfer happened. What is confirmed is that wherever Elizabeth Báthory was finally laid to rest, her grave remains unmarked to this day. Čachtice Castle reopened to visitors on July 20, 2014. The local museum runs an exhibition called Cruelty Hidden in Lace. The castle sits in modern Slovakia, but Báthory was Hungarian, which creates a contested memory. In Hungary, historians are more likely to argue conspiracy. In Slovakia, she is marketed as dark tourism, and the Bloody Lady of Čachtice remains one of the country's most popular attractions. The Guinness record has been removed. The trial transcripts, available in English for the first time thanks to Kimberly Craft, show something far more complicated and far less certain than the legend. Whether Elizabeth Báthory killed anyone remains genuinely unknown. What is known is that a Jesuit monk in 1729 invented the most famous detail of her story, that 250 of her witnesses were repeating rumours, that her accusers owed her money, and that her grave sits unmarked somewhere in Hungary, belonging to a woman who was convicted of nothing.